Over 500 Democratic Party staffers and alumni of Joe Biden's presidential campaign have signed an open letter calling for Biden to hold Israel accountable and for him to do more to protect Palestinians living in the occupied territories. Now, I'll get to what's in this letter. First, it's worth noting here that this was signed by both Arab and Jewish Americans, and I'll get to more examples in a minute here of various Jewish groups coming out in support of Palestinians and against the far extremist right-wing Israeli government. First here, let me share a piece of this letter and then get to some of the demands that are in the letter. So first up here, as you tweeted last month, referring to Joe Biden, quote, "No responsible American president can remain silent when basic human rights are violated. We could not agree more. That is why we ask you to unequivocally condemn Israel's killing of Palestinian civilians. We thank you for your work to end the most recent round of violence between Israel and Hamas, to ensure a lasting ceasefire and a future of peace and security for Israelis and Palestinians. We ask that you work to end the underlying conditions of occupation, blockade, and settlement expansion that led to this exceptionally destructive period in a 73-year history of dispossession and ethnic cleansing. The resulting status quo is one that international and Israeli human rights organizations agree meets the definition of the crime of apartheid under international law. Finally, we are deeply concerned that Israel continues to use U.S.-funded military equipment to kill civilians, target journalists, and violently suppress protests in Israel, the West Bank, and Jerusalem." So I will link to the full letter below the video in the description box on YouTube. As you can see here, there is a lot more to it, so you can read through it all if you want. But it essentially goes along the same lines, calling out Biden so far for his inaction, while also trying to, approach this in a welcoming way, complimenting him as well for the little that he has said, but ultimately here calling on him to have demands of the Israeli government, which of course Biden so far has not. So let me read for you what those demands are. Allow a humanitarian corridor in Gaza to allow for the evacuation of the injured, as well as for the supply of life-saving medicines. Take action to protect Palestinians in Israel, subject to ongoing violent attacks by Israeli mobs that operate with the protection of Israeli police. Lift the blockade of Gaza, which has made it an uninhabitable open-air prison. End the forced expulsion of Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah and from all Palestinian homes across the territories. End settlement expansion in the West Bank. And join our international allies in calling for an end to Israeli violations of international law, or at minimum, stop obstructing efforts by the United Nations to do so. Ensure U.S. aid no longer funds the imprisonment and torture of Palestinian children, theft and demolition of Palestinian homes and property, and annexation of Palestinian land. Investigate whether Israel's most recent assault on Gaza violates the Leahy Law, prohibiting U.S. military aid from funding foreign military units implicated in the commission of gross violations of human rights. End federal tax breaks for donations to settler organizations that actively fund the ongoing dispossession and expulsion of Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah and other cities by revoking their 501c3 status. Support Palestinians' right to self-determination. So you see here a fairly comprehensive list of demands calling on Joe Biden to put this forward to the right-wing Israeli government. Now, will Joe Biden do any of this? Will he listen to this letter? No, of course not. Joe Biden has his own views. He's been very consistent on this issue, even more to the right on this issue, more in support of a far right-wing Israeli government than even George Bush was back in the early 2000s. Joe Biden actually criticized George Bush for not doing more to support the right-wing Israeli government. So Joe Biden has not really changed at all on this issue. So understanding how long he has been in politics and how long he has held that position, and understanding all of that, I'm not sure what it's going to take for Joe Biden to change. At the same time, though, it's worth recognizing that moves like this, letters like this, help to open the eyes of the public. And you're seeing public perception shifting. You're seeing the media reporting on this issue a little more accurately, at least at times. Certain segments report on this story accurately. As I've covered in the past, Ali Velshi on MSNBC, for example, is maybe the best example of that. But you're seeing these moments, these letters, groups come together to call out what is going on in Israel and stand up for Palestinians. Now, there are more examples of that before I get to those examples. Let me just show you some of these names. So Biden for president, people that work directly with Joe Biden here, list of names there. People that work at the DNC, list of names there. And then you have state by state, people that organize for Joe Biden in each of these states during the primary campaign and the presidential campaign. So a lot of names here. Obviously, I'm not going to read through this, but there you go. And if you want to add your name, if you happen to work for Joe Biden and are not on this list but want to add your name, you can, once I get to it, here we go. You can DM this person on Twitter and get your name on there. Now, let me give you some of these examples of people coming together to have their voices heard. So Jewish Google employees ask company to end its ties with Israeli military. An open letter by 250 diverse Jewish and allied Googlers urges the tech giant to end its ties with institutions that support Israeli violations of Palestinian rights. So there are many examples of this, and I think this also helps to educate people who find this topic daunting. The average person really does not know the intricacies of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and they don't need to know the intricacies of it, because all you really have to understand is you have a power dynamic here. You have a right-wing Israeli government backed by the world's superpowers like the U.S. And on the other side, you have Palestinians living in, for example, in Gaza, in an open-air prison where Israel controls its borders, won't allow Palestinians to leave. And you have the Israeli government bombing one of the most densely populated areas on earth. 2 million people live in Gaza in a tiny strip of land. And these people can't leave. And in addition to that, you've had the ongoing ethnic cleansing, the Israeli government forcing Palestinians from their homes. This has been ongoing for decades. All you really need to understand are those two facts, that the complete imbalance of power here. You have Palestinians with no power whatsoever, and an apartheid state in Israel where Palestinians are treated differently than Jewish members of the country are, Jewish citizens are. So the whole dynamic it's clear, and having Jewish groups like this come out and state that and be critical of the Israeli government and stand up for Palestinians, I think helps to educate people on this issue as well. Another example of that, B'Tselem, an Israeli-based human rights organization, early in January labeled for the first time Israel an apartheid regime. So also goes to help educating people on this issue when you have an Israel-based human rights organization calling this out and being consistent as well over the most recent bout of violence, calling out Israel on that as well. Independent Jewish Voices tweeted out early on in the most recent, May 10th. So, quote, as Canadian Jews, many of whom came to Canada fleeing anti-Jewish persecution and violence, we refuse to sit back idly while Israel commits these atrocities in our names. Another example here, Jewish Voice for Peace, the Nakba, the forced expulsion of Palestinians from their homes and lands, began in 1948 and continues today, not just in Sheikh Jarrah, Jerusalem, but also in Gaza, where civilian home destruction by Israeli bombs have made hundreds of families homeless in recent days. So having these groups come out, having the media cover this story properly, you are really seeing a shift in public perception. And at some point, this will change. There will be a shift in U.S. government policy. I'm not saying Biden will do it, but I'm saying when you have public perception shift this much, something's got to give. So, and it's just, you look at any details, just read up a little bit on this crisis. It is so obvious who is in the right and who is in the wrong. Now, I'm not sure what it would take for Joe Biden to change. I don't think he'll change, regardless of what is put forward. But that doesn't mean that these sorts of actions aren't still necessary. This is how you help to change public perception. This is how you help to change what lawmakers find positive for them in their campaigns. So when you have the vast majority of people understanding this crisis, standing up for Palestinians, that all of a sudden puts pressure on lawmakers to change their positions on this issue as well. And for the first time, you're seeing, the largest number of Democrats in Congress actually willing to speak out on this issue. So while change is not coming in the way that it should, as quick as it should, at the very least, you are seeing change happening. You are seeing people become educated, and the pressure is growing.